Hello everyone, welcome to this online session on Where the Web Things Are. I'm Ruben Verborg. I work at Ghent University IMEC here in Belgium, but at the moment I'm live streaming from home and I probably think that all of you are home, so thanks for joining in. Today's going to be an, if I may say so, exciting session. Of course, I may say so, it's my session, where I'll tell you about what happened to the web in the past and how we could go about fixing that. First of all, some housekeeping announcements. So this is a live session, so feel free to interact. I'm keeping an eye on the chat, so if you have any questions, please bring them out on chat. I'll be very happy to take them at any point during the presentation. This session is recorded, so you have the right to remain silent, but everything you do say can be used against you at a later point in time. However, don't be afraid to speak up. I'd be very happy to take any of your comments into consideration. That being said, let us get started. So, I assume that quite a bit of you have a library background, as this is a talk in the lunch library series of UGent and the Faculty of Art and Arts. So where the Web Things Are is obviously inspired by the Maurice Sendak book from 1963 already, Where the Wild Things Are. And this book tells the story about Max, who arrives in a very crazy world. And obviously he's dreaming, but the good thing is that what starts out as a scary dream actually turns out to be a world which he can control, and he quickly becomes king, and all the monsters listen to him. So this to me shows that, it's about, even if you arrive at a scary place, think about how you want to change it and what you could change to be in control. And control is what we will be talking about quite a bit today, because the same nightmare also happens to the person depicted right here. This is Hossein Dereksan. He used to be an Iranian blogger. Back in the early 2000s, he had his own blog, and he was a bit critical of the existing regime back then, so he was posting things online that would have been difficult to post elsewhere. But thanks to the power of the web, he was able to get his opinion out. He could link to other blogs, and together they formed a network which guided critical thinkers to ideas they might not have seen elsewhere. So he really managed to grab the power of the web to get an important message out. Now, unfortunately, he was jailed for having an opinion, in fact, and he spent a couple of years in jail. And during those years, he did not have any access to the internet. And the image right here depicts the moment when he was released and suddenly surfaced in a world with a web that was completely different from the one that he had left behind. Because back when, before he went to jail, the web was one that people controlled. Anyone could start a blog, have an opinion, and you would share things on your own terms. You would be free to design the experience. Like you could freely write, draw, express yourself whatever way you wanted, even if you had opinions that were not the mainstream opinions, so to speak. But then when he resurfaced, what he saw that was that this network that was actually people driven had now changed, in the sense that people didn't have blogs anymore. People just posted things on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, and so on. And that was very shocking to him, because obviously he wondered, is this what I went to jail for? Like, I had an opinion that was dangerous back then, and now everyone just posts on Facebook. But it's not just about producing content, it's also about the consumption. Because back in the days, you had to be a critical consumer. You had to follow the links yourself and be guided by blogs and so on to find the information that you wanted to find. But all those networks had transformed the web into a stream, into TV. You just passively consume whatever comes at you, and the things coming at you are not the things that are best for you. They're just the things that keep you online for the longest times. So it was very frightening for him to come back into that world. And this is an inspiration for the story that I'll be telling today. So I have three parts prepared for you. First, I'll talk about the World Wide Web, like what it means and why it is so important. And then also go into the threats that the web is currently facing. The second section, we will look what we could do to get out of the nightmare. Like, how can we take back control? What would that look like? What would the implications be? And finally, I'll apply this to scholarly communication, because we have an ongoing Melon project in which we apply those principles to also free scholars from the burdens that they currently experience online. As I've said, feel free to interrupt me at any time. I'm keeping a close eye on the chat, and also for people having a webcam, I also watch some head movements. So if you look confused, then I'll slow down. If you look bored, I'll go a little faster. So the feedback is really important to me. All right, so let's dive in the first part on the World Wide Web. There, first, I want to talk about something very important called universality. Now, let's think back about the world before the web. And let's be honest, it's a world that not a lot of us really consciously remember, right? Because it's everywhere right now. But the thing was that even though the internet existed, so all machines were connected worldwide via cables, it was still very hard to exchange information, because connected by those cables were all kinds of different machines, devices with different software. So it was very hard to get information around. People just kept on sending stuff that was incompatible. What the web has changed was also innovation in addition to that. Because if you wanted to innovate back then, you had to pick one type of machine, one operating system, and this is where your software would work. So the reach of your information and your innovation was very limited in the world before the World Wide Web. Now, what the web adds on top of the internet is a document system so we can freely share information. So putting something online is really a notion that came widespread with the web. And this is because one of the most important things about the World Wide Web is universality. The fact that information is independent of many, many different factors. And indeed, we can use websites regardless of what device we're using. You might be using a Windows computer or Linux or Mac or even a handheld device, a tablet phone, it doesn't matter. You can use the web from any device. So that was kind of the big revolution. So whatever you're using, you can access the web. It also applies to different kinds of people. For instance, people with bad eyesight, they might need larger letters. No problem, the web can accommodate. Or even they might need a braille reader. All those things are supported on the web. This is universality, making sure that the information is really available to everyone and not just people with certain specific devices or needs, for instance. This also means for innovation that people are free. Because before the web, you had to pick exactly one machine on which you would deploy your innovation. But thanks to the web, you just write software for the web. You write a web application. It works on mobile, works on any kind of laptop or tablet. So universality is a core concept, the fact that everyone can access whatever we put on the web. And how is this realized? Well, thanks to standards. So standards ensure that we have to write it once and can reuse it again on multiple platforms. And of course, the good thing is the web is also freely available. And here on screen is a tweet that Tim Berners-Lee sent out during the opening ceremony of the Olympics. So few people knew who Tim Berners-Lee was, and fewer even understood the message, "This is for everyone." But when he tweeted out that message live from the Olympic Stadium, what he wanted to say is, well, look, this is universality. The fact that you can read this tweet from any kind of device, it goes over the web. This is the core message, is the important thing. And it's not just freely available in technology terms. The technology itself can also just be implemented by everyone. So you don't need to basically knock Tim Berners-Lee's door, even though he invented the web. You can make things without involving him, which is very cool. So this technical innovation has resulted in freedom of expression to everyone across the world. And on the web, we try to capture this notion as anyone can say anything about anything. Whether this is a good or bad thing depends on the circumstances, obviously, but generally in a democracy, we like to think that this is a good thing as long as people stay within legal limits. And also interesting is that we all have our own spaces, so we don't have to agree. Means I can put things on my website, you can put things on yours, we can disagree, and we are free to do so because, we all speak in our own spaces. And if you don't like what I'm writing, well, then don't go read it. This is very possible. And thanks to the power of hyperlinks, we can connect our opinions. So if I'm saying something about something that you've written, I can just link to your post. I don't have to bring it to the same space. Things can coexist in different spaces. You could say, well, of course, yeah, but this is very different from how we do discussion today. If you think about centralized platforms where you're not in control of how your content is treated, where it goes, and so on. So the other way to look at this freedom of expression from an innovation perspective is permissionless innovation. The fact that you can build anything for any reason and you don't need anyone's permission to do so. If you and I want, we can start our own shop and tomorrow we'll be selling things online and we don't need to knock anyone's door for that. We can just do it. We can just hook our own server to the World Wide Web and it will just work. We don't need permission to innovate. This is something very cool and very powerful. And you could say, well, yeah, of course, this is how things work. Well, think again. If you look at app stores, for instance, let's say the Google Play Store on Android or the Apple Store on iPhones and so on, you need Apple's permission to publish an app. And if you're doing an app that conflicts with their business interests, well, your app is not going to be launched, right? So this whole idea of freedom was very new when the web introduced it, but certain more recent initiatives don't have the same permissionless innovation that the web has given to all of us. So this was the important thing about the web, like universality, how it basically is accessible for everyone as a consumer and also as a producer. Unfortunately, this universality has been under threat and in fact has been multiple times since the creation and the invention of the web back in '89. So a first threat to universality were the browser wars. Those of us who are old enough to remember the late 90s, early 2000s, it was not uncommon to see a button on a website. This site is best viewed with Internet Explorer or Netscape were the two choices, basically. But this, if you look at it bigger than technology, is actually a threat to universality. Because it means that if you're not using the right browser, well, too bad, then you cannot access this information, you cannot use this app. And this means that people also need a certain computer. So if you don't have a Windows computer, if you didn't pay Microsoft a license, well, too bad, you cannot access this information. If you have a mobile device, it's not Microsoft, well, too bad you cannot access it, right? So this might seem like a technical concern. Oh, well, I'll just use a different browser, but actually has implications on the kind of things people need to buy. And if people need to buy something, has a consequence on like who you include in the information space, right? So this is indeed, I mean, we should always see it in a bigger picture. Like universality is the main message to me. From an innovation perspective, it also means that as a developer, you depend on how fast Microsoft goes. So if you had a fancy app and Explorer was a bit slow at running it, well, too bad. You depend on Microsoft to fix their browser before you can launch innovation. So that was a big threat to universality. Now, fortunately, today the landscape is much better. Like we're all using different browsers. For instance, I don't know what you're using, but I'm browsing these slides here right in Firefox and it works. But if you're using Chrome, they will also equally work. So let me maybe actually put that to the test. If I now take this URL and I put it into the chat window, then you are free to open it with any browser of your choice and it should still work. This is universality. So that was a bad thing. Today we're all using different browsers, mobile, desktop, and so on. So that war has been won in the sense that no one won, we all coexist. However, what actually happened is the war never really concluded. It just got replaced by a different war, namely the search engine wars. Because at some point it didn't really matter which browser you used to access the web, as long as you went through the one search engine to find your information. So the quest for the browser was replaced by a quest for what is the entry point you use to get onto the web. Which means as a company, if your information is not on Google, well, too bad, people won't find you and they'll go to competitors. Also means that ranking high on Google became more important than having high quality content. And this is perhaps where some of the origins of fake news and clickbait and so on have started. It also means from an innovation perspective that the reach of your innovations depends on what crawler is being used. Like if you build a nice product and Google doesn't pick it up, well, too bad, it's like you never existed. This battle also was never really concluded because it simply got replaced by another, the platform wars, which is a war in search for our personal data and our identity. Like soon it didn't really matter which search engine you used because nobody uses search engines. Everybody finds information on social media, right? Again, I'm exaggerating, but you get the point. So in this case, well, if you're not on Facebook, too bad. Things are happening and you can see them. And also here we saw that clicks became more important than having high quality content, because now it's a completely passive thing. People just watch TV, they follow the stream, and if you're not in the stream, well, you don't exist. And from an innovation perspective, it means that you either compete with Facebook or you depend on it. Because if you and I are going to build our store tomorrow, if people don't have a button to sign in with Facebook, they might just skip it and go to our competitor who has. So suddenly we depend on Facebook. And also people don't have a choice anymore, suddenly, because they are obliged to have a Facebook account if they want to see those pictures that were taken at the party we all were at yesterday, right? Or if they want to interact with certain people, they need a Facebook account, even though they might not want it for whatever reason. So again, it's a threat to universality, the fact that we all use the same space to discuss instead of being able to have our own spaces on our own terms. Now, and a consequence of this is that our data has become centralized in a small number of platforms on the web. Things that used to be on people's personal blogs, well, you will now find them on Facebook, Twitter, and so on. And by the way, this is not an attack on social media or anything, because this happens everywhere. It's the same thing. Let's take another online example for resumes, for instance. If you're looking for work, well, you better have a LinkedIn profile. It doesn't matter if you also have it on your own website. It needs to be on LinkedIn or people won't find you. It also applies to e-health, for instance. It also applies to retail and shopping, like all of our accounts. They also become centralized in platforms. I'm just using the example of social media because it's so ubiquitous, but it happens everywhere. So it's not just the Facebooks and Twitters of this world who are to blame. And we actually have to give them credit. They have lowered the entry barrier. Like, it was a bit more complex to start your own blog, but basically everyone and their dog can start a Facebook account. It's so easy. So we have to give them credit for that. At the same time, we lost control. On our own spaces, we can decide exactly what happens to our data and who sees it. On Facebook, on Twitter, on any platform, we don't have control. We've lost it. And of course, this has far-reaching consequences for privacy, and you'll read about privacy every day much more than you want, but privacy is not the issue. I will explain in a couple of slides, actually, that privacy is a consequence of how things are happening, but it's not a cause. So we need to think very differently about this, and to me, the real issue is the lack of control. And if you look at it from the perspective of what we've said so far, it also endangers universality. Because suddenly, if you want to read certain things, well, you have to sign in with Facebook. And if you don't have an account, well, too bad, you need it. Or sometimes even, yeah, you need to use the native app if you want to use Facebook for the best experience. And this is very weird by itself, because if you look at history, the big benefit of the web was that the information of the whole world could be accessed with one piece of software, namely the browser. And suddenly we're going to undo all of those innovations and just say, no, you need the latest iPhone with the latest Facebook app if you want the best experience. So the idea of having openness and a web that works for everyone is really threatened by these kind of actions. And of course, this leads to a picture that you might have seen. These are the famous silos, the walled gardens of social media. Because all of those platforms, they don't work together. They all have their own spaces. And it's like there's a wall around those spaces, indeed. What does this mean? Well, simply said, I cannot share Facebook pictures with my colleagues on LinkedIn. I either have to copy the data, and then my data is spread out everywhere, or I have to move the people. And this means that I oblige them to have an account with a platform they might not want to have an account with. So it's either moving people or moving data, but in any case, we totally lost control, and this is very, very worrisome. And you could say, but how does this happen? Why can't we fix this? All we need is somebody to just do better innovation, because we have permissionless innovation. Anyone can just build the right thing, and then we will be rid of all those platforms. Well, unfortunately, this is not how it works. Because permissionless innovation was so strong and so present on the web that it even allowed the invention of platforms that go completely against the spirit of permissionless innovation. And I think it's beautifully captured in the words of John Naughton from The Guardian when he says, "The Facebook founder has no intention of allowing anyone to build anything on his platform that does not have his express approval." Having profited mightily from the web's openness, he has kicked away the ladder that elevated him to his current eminence. I thought that's a very beautiful image where you really see Tim Berners-Lee building a platform on which Mark Zuckerberg puts his ladder, climbs all the way up, builds his Facebook, and then says, well, you know what? I'm kicking away the ladder. It's mine now. You'll have to listen to my terms. And this is actually kind of what happened. Now I realize at this point it's getting a bit grim and dark, but no worries. This second part is all about what we can do to make things better. I will talk to you about the Solid project. Solid is an initiative by Tim Berners-Lee because he's worried about what is becoming of his invention, the World Wide Web. Now, Solid is a story with many facets, so if you remember one thing, let it be choice. What we aim to do with the Solid project is restore choice on the web for everyone, because today we don't have those choices, as I will show you in a bit. Solid is an ecosystem. It enables people to pick the apps they need and the services they need while independently choosing where they store their data. So what we're trying to do is separate the choice of where your data is and the kind of apps and services and websites that you want to use. So people control their own data. They put it in their own personal data vault, a data pod as we call it. So they have their own space where they put their data and they fully control that space, just like a blog back in the days, except that this space does not consist of web pages or blog posts, but it consists of pieces of data about you. So people control their own data in a personal data vault and they can share it with the apps and people that they choose. So they are always in control. So what happens here is that every person in the world gets their own space, their own data vault, and in there they store all the data that they themselves create or that other parties create about them. Let's have a look at what this means. Again, we'll use social media as an example, but the principles here generalize to many other domains. So it's definitely not just about social media, but the principle is very easily illustrated with it. So here we have a view that you're probably all very familiar with. This is a social media post, right? And there's a profile picture on there, there's some text, there's some comments and so on. Well, nowadays, a view like this, all the piece of data you need to build that view, they would typically come from one place. Facebook, Twitter, whatever. They come from one place. However, if we all get a personal data pod, then suddenly information can come from many different places. Let's have a look. For instance, if this is my social media post, well, this profile picture, it's mine. It's going to be stored in my personal data vault. This text is mine, is going to be stored in my data pod. And if one of you reacts to my post, well, this reaction is yours, it's going to be stored in your personal data vault. If someone else replies to your reaction, well, this reply is going to be stored in their data vault. And even a piece of data as small as a like. If somebody likes your post, well, this like is theirs. It's going to be stored in their data vault. It doesn't matter whether they created the like or whether an application or a company created for them. It's their like, so they have the right to store it. Now, this is a small principle with quite big consequences. Let us compare the situation today to the situation that we'll have in the future. So on the left-hand side, you see today where we have centralized web applications and they couple the application and the data together. They're inseparably connected. So when I say Facebook, it's also my Facebook because I can't separate the app from the data. And here we see the silo problem in action, right? So I cannot share my Facebook pictures with my LinkedIn colleagues because indeed they're stuck within the Facebook silo. And also there's a synchronization problem. If I accept an event in Facebook, well, then Doodle won't know about it. And so all I'm doing is constantly moving data around. It's 2020 and we are still moving data into systems as people. This is weird. Just to give you one example, for instance, have you tried recently to change your profile picture? Now, in how many places do you have to change that picture? And probably a couple of months or even a year later, you still find that old ugly picture that you wanted to replace. Now, this shows that the need of data is spread out, that we've lost control. Now, compare this to the right-hand side, which is a situation that we're in today. These are decentralized applications where we don't have to go through a central point to interact. And notice those purple rectangles here, they're the same as on the left-hand side, but the data has been pushed out. So my pictures, my calendar, my contact list, they all reside in my personal data pod. And I can start with one application to work on my pictures and can continue seamlessly with another. And there's also no synchronization problem because there's no copies of the data. Because, if I change my profile picture here, all the applications will follow. And I get a question now, what happens when some of the different pieces of data disappear? Well, this is interesting because disappear can have several meanings. So disappear would mean that either I'm deciding that a certain application or a certain person cannot see those pieces of data anymore. All right, fair enough. Well, what happens? Well, then this person or this application is not allowed to see it, and this is their problem, basically, right? Another noise of disappear could be that I decided to delete a piece of my data. I might have a good reason for that in which I don't want it to exist, which is also fine because this is my personal data. I have that choice. And maybe I'll try to limit the legal stuff today, but still, to just show that this is not utopia. Actually, for all of this, we also have the legal basis here in Europe, and this legal basis is called GDPR. So GDPR gives us the possibility to do that. It is actually already possible today to go to Facebook, LinkedIn, to go to your supermarket, your bank, your employer, and say, give me all the data you have about me. So you can already store it in your personal data pod. And you can also tell them you have to delete this piece of data, and they have to do it. So that doesn't change. So to this question, what happens when piece of data disappear? Well, this also can happen today already. This is us being in control, except that exercising that control is much more difficult when your data is all spread around. Whereas if you keep it in your personal data pod, as is your legal right, by the way, then it gets much easier to control. You can actually decide what happens because this purple boundary right here is you deciding what requests are answered and which requests are not answered. So you can decide for every piece of data who gets to see what. So this is great for people, it's great for choice, but, and this is important, it's also great for innovation. Let's again look at the left-hand side here. So this is the current situation where we have this single market for centralized applications. And they're in competition with each other, but the competition is based on not who has the best innovation, but who has the most data. And this is a very boring competition because there's only one winner in every market segment. Like if you want employment data, LinkedIn. If you want social networking, it's Facebook. And we have examples everywhere on that. There's two really serious consequences from that. First, the big players don't innovate. And this seems weird, but look at Facebook. It's arguably one of the biggest tech companies on the planet. They don't innovate. Let me explain. Can any one of you think about an innovation that Facebook has done to your newsfeed that has improved that newsfeed for you anywhere in the past 10 years? And 10 years being an eternity in terms of IT. I see people, I can think of one. And even someone saying, no, it's not even chronological anymore. So it's even gotten worse in some points. Well, let me tell you, they've done an innovation. We used to have only a like. Now we have 5 different emotions. But that's about it. This is the innovation of the past 10 years. Now, why doesn't Facebook innovate? First of all, they don't need to. They have your data already. Second, they're building a product for the average user, which doesn't exist. And this is very difficult because every change they do, always someone will be grumpy about it. So first problem, the big ones don't innovate. The second problem is even worse. If we have a company who wants to innovate, suppose that I have, or any one of you has a brilliant idea to make the newsfeed experience better. Well, too bad. You don't have the data, so you cannot enter the market. This is a consequence of a competition based purely on who has the most data. Innovation loses. And this is terrible for all of us. There's no more permissionless innovation there. Now let's compare this to the situation that we'll get when we do personal data vaults. What actually happens is that you got a competition, a separate competition on 2 levels. On one hand, you get competition between apps. On the other hand, you get competitions between data vault providers. And the good thing is that these are not winner-takes-all competitions. Let me give you an example. Today, literally, grandmothers and grandchildren are using the same Facebook application. Not because it's a great experience for any of those people, but it's because where the data is. Otherwise, they cannot communicate. This is terrible. It's 2020 and we're using apps we don't even like because we have to. This is where our friends are. This is where the data is. If we have personal data vaults, we can all choose different apps and still interact because the data is in our vaults, not in the apps. And this is a competition in which grandmother and grandchild have different apps, and those apps give them the best experience. And if they don't, no worries, somebody will make a better app and they can switch because they can just bring their data along since the data is stored in their own data vault. The same thing will happen on the data market. There will be different data vaults. Some of them will be free, meaning that, well, you give your personal data, it gets mined, you get advertising. If you want that, fair enough. Who am I to judge? Some solutions will be paying, where you say, well, look, if you pay this provider $5 or $10 a month, then your data is safe and nothing happens to it. Fair enough. And notice how I'm not saying that people need more privacy. All I'm saying is that people need more choice because they don't have the choice today. You can go to Facebook and say, well, Facebook, here's $10 a month, but please leave my data alone. I just want to talk to people. You can't do that. You don't have the choice. So this is about creating choices in different markets and about stimulating innovation. I also see an incoming message that there's a tension between privacy requirements and requirements of memory that hasn't been solved correctly legally yet. Indeed, and I'm not a lawyer, so I will not be giving you legal advice. However, there's an interesting thing I have to mention there. Because sometimes when I present this idea, people say, well, choice, that's good for you if you have the money to pay for personal storage. This means that people who don't have the money for that or who have different priorities, well, they will just, have their data mined and they're already vulnerable and they'll be even more vulnerable. Let me give you an example. So we're currently having a quite good collaboration here in Belgium with the Flemish government, and this is how they think about it. Here in Belgium, every citizen gets electricity, gas, water, and we can choose a provider of our choice. Right? So it's not the government making electricity, they're certified providers. However, independently of the choice, the government says every Belgian citizen gets a yearly allowance of free water, free gas, and free electricity, such that everyone has their basic needs satisfied. We can do the exact same thing with data storage. We can also see it as a utility, where the government says, look, every citizen gets 2 to 5 gigabytes, I'm just saying something because it's really cheap, of storage free per year with a provider of choice, and will certify providers. And this is how you can guarantee that people have their storage needs met, while still giving them a free choice. So those things should not be in contradiction with each other. Then I get Sandrine asking, so you store your own data in a private storage tool in the cloud or something. How will your data be safe? So a couple of things. First of all, just like the World Wide Web, it's about standards, right? So you can choose your provider in the cloud, or you can even self-host in your living room. I have literally a pod on the server that I host myself. That's all possible. Now, how will data be safe? First of all, you have a choice of providers. So I can expect there to be providers that give certain guarantees and so on the safety of your data. So the fact that there's choice means you can choose safe solutions. Also, going back to the previous point where I said, like, look, the utility argument where the government certifies parties is interesting because I'm not allowed, to start making my own electricity, at least not at large scale. So the government certifies parties that can do that in a safe way. We could do the same thing for data. And so by certification could be one means of guaranteeing that. Then we got these providers should be extra safe because all of your data is concentrated in one pot. This is interesting. It also gets a little bit technical there, because what I'm saying is that people need at least one pod, but they could be multiple because some data is more sensitive than others. For instance, I might choose to store my medical data in a pod that is much more guarded than where I store my family pictures. I mean, both of them are sensitive. I don't like any of those to be public, but if I might have to choose, well, my medical data deserves some extra attention there. So you have multiple vaults indeed. Now regarding the concentration argument, today of course it works different, right? Because if you look at the Equifax scandal, for instance, in the US, like 2 years ago, lots of people's social security numbers and so on got leaked. Now, if you look at it from an economical perspective, it probably cost the hackers a couple of 100,000, maybe a couple of million to hack the thing, but then the benefits they had were tremendous. However, hacking one person's data part is probably not going to be as cost efficient. So you have to be really deliberate to hack one person. But suppose you are, this means this person is a high profile target, which means that that person might want to choose a different type of storage. And so the risks are different indeed. So you can spread your pods, and there's different ways of thinking about risk. And then I also get that governments must, of course, be democratic ones. Yeah, that this remains an issue with these things. I'm making a couple of very, well, not very optimistic assumptions here. What I'm saying definitely holds for our countries here in Europe and neighboring, but indeed, this is not everywhere like that. But then your other arguments still stand. You can also choose your own provider in a location that your government cannot access if you're under an undemocratic regime. So all of these things are possible. So choice means much more than just choosing what the government lets you choose. So, but these are the right questions. Like the fact that these questions arrive, they tell me that you're indeed reflecting on the concept, which is a good sign, I would say. So these were the principles. Now, it's more than just principles, actually, because we're working on this technology, actually, and this is part of the Solid project. And Solid starts from existing web technology. So basically, a Solid pod is like a website. It uses the same technology, except that there's also access control, and it uses standards that are on the data level instead of on the page level. So Solid is like the web, but for personal data, for elementary data facts, and with all of the extra layers of access control and security. But this to say that we're not starting from something entirely new. I mean, the goal is actually to have compatibility with existing systems and build on the same principles that already allow online banking and other really critical things today. And so we're starting from a very trusted technology stack right there. Now, Solid is not a company organization. It's also not just software. It's an ecosystem. It's a movement. It's a community in the sense that it's an ecosystem of standards, right? So remember, the goal of the web is universality. So the fact that any web page can be viewed on any device is important, and this works thanks to standards. Well, Solid wants to do the same thing, but then for data, so that every piece of data can be viewed by any application that you give permission. So this is the kind of scale that we're thinking about. It's also a movement in the sense that we try to shift the mindset of people building apps. Because right now, if you build an app, the first thing you have to do is collect data. But nobody really likes it, because then you're in direct competition with Facebook and the big ones. So this is building apps with data that already exists and reusing existing data that people give you permission for. It's also a community of different people, companies, and organizations working together. I'm getting a question on sensitive data, whether it's encrypted. So there's two answers on that. So first, the scope of the Solid standards is in a communication. So it's about how data is exchanged between a person, a company, and a pod. And this exchange, in practice, happens over HTTPS, right? So the same protocols that keep, for instance, your banking data safe online, they're protocols that will be used to exchange data. So this is the secure transfer of data around. The other aspect is also secure storage. And Solid does not govern what happens on the storage side, also to enable choice. So depending on your needs, you can have different kind of encryption at rest. But the encryption and transfer is completely governed by existing security protocols, and they are in fact encrypted. Now, just to give you some ideas. So what could be in a data pod? Well, actually anything you want. So here's some trivial examples with social media. It could be your profile, your pictures, videos, comments, likes, but basically any piece of data you create can be stored in a pod. It's just like a USB stick, except it's connected to the web and it's with full access control, so you decide what happens to it. So anything you can imagine you can store. So this is again the freedom of expression. Now, what kind of applications could you build with Solid? Well, again, whatever you can imagine. It's permissionless innovation again. So we could build calendars, social feeds, photo sharing, or a tracking system for the coronavirus. And I'm not joking, we're actually working on this right now. So you might have heard that some governments are now tracking how people are moving to see how they're spreading things. Actually, with Solid, we say, keep your own data, keep track of what you're doing. And if something happens to you or to people close to you, you can share this data in a trusted way only with healthcare providers. So it's a very, very different way to think about data. And again, you're only limited by your imagination. So this was, so far, the World Wide Web and what we can do to take control of our personal data. Before I go to the next part, I see one more question. Would you also add your academic publications here? The answer is yes. In fact, I have a whole section dedicated to it, which is the one we're going into. So perfect timing on that one. So let me give you an example of a poor small-scale metadata producer, and this poor small-scale metadata producer happens to be me. Because I'm a scientist, so I also have publications, and those publications come with a lot of metadata as well. Now, normally you would assume that the source, knowing most about the things that I've written, you would imagine that to be me, right? However, there is a whole range of organizations that desperately try to convince me that they know better than myself what I've been doing scientifically, and it's just very impressive. So let me just show you how I've lost control of my publication metadata, which, by the way, is public data. So this shows that it's not a matter of privacy, because I also lost control of my public data. So here is my profile in Google Scholar, and maybe have a quick look at the number of publications and so on. You'll see that it will be very different from what you see in ResearchGate, which in turn is different from what you're seeing in academia, which is in turn different from what you see in Mendeley. And by the way, Mendeley, there's a second person with my name, but there's no two Ruben Verboys in the world. It's just a shadow profile, none of which I created, by the way. Anyways, we continue. Then there's also DBLP, who thinks to know what I've published. Notice again, totally different numbers right there. There's also Orchid, who, of course, tries to be the one to rule them all, but unfortunately fail. Even UGent, I really appreciate UGent library people. They do great work, but even they're not up to date because, they're a little bit behind, because when I have publication accepted, it has to go through certain steps before it can arrive there, right? Someone said I made my point. I'm not done yet. I have not fully made my point. Sorry about that. Because there's also Microsoft. And on Microsoft, there's not one profile for me, but there's 11. So here's the first Ruben, here's the second Ruben, here's the third, and so on. And there's also this one, which only has one publication. That's really sad, but notice how misrepresented I am there. Now I've made my point. And this is all really sad, especially because I have been publishing the correct version of the truth since before many of those networks even existed. And it's a correct record. If you have a look at my website, you will find metadata about every single publication I've written. I'm the source of truth. I know what I wrote. Trust me. I've got one page for my publications, and for every publication, and a page that lists them all, and they're correct and complete. So just go there. There's even semantics in there. It's published as linked data. I mean, it's even CC0. So if I could, and I'm not joking, if I could, I would pay each of those providers easily 10 euros, make it 20, to just suck the data out of my website and use it because it's a correct record. And I don't know why they don't do that. Because this is insanity. I'm being misrepresented, and as a scientist, my publications are my reputation. So what I used to do was basically every month go through all those websites and update it manually, but now I've said, you know what, screw it. The truth is on my website if you want to pick it from there. So I've lost control of my data. Now, the good news is we're actually trying to fix these and many other concerns regarding scholarly communication. Together with Herbert van der Zompel, we have a Mellon project. It's a project from the Andrew Mellon Foundation, and it's on scholarly communications using the decentralized web. So basically, what we are doing is apply the solid principles to scholarly communication. And it's a collaboration between UGent here in Belgium and DANS in the Netherlands. So let me explain in a couple of slides what we aim to do, and thereby also answering Annemiek's question that just came in. So scholarly communication has the four well-known functions, and the question that we're looking into is how can we fulfill those four functions of scholarly communication, but without depending on central actors in the way. And it doesn't mean that central actors are bad. It's just we don't think they're sustainable. For instance, Orchid is really trying their best to keep a record up to date. It's just not easy, and we have no guarantee about how long they will be up. I hope for a long time because they're doing quite good work, but if there's anything we've learned about sustainability from the past, is that nothing remains permanent. So let's have a look at how we can fulfill those functions. So there's registration, which means that we can prove that we were the first to make a certain claim. There's certification, which means that, for instance, other experts have a look at my claim and they say yes or no, it's valid or not. Then there's awareness, which means informing other scientists about the claims that I make. And there's, of course, the important role of archiving, where we aim to preserve the scholarly record over time. So what we see today is in the central system is that many actors try to couple all those functions together. For instance, back to the question I had, like, would this remain with a publisher because this needs to be URI? Well, this goes to the heart of that thing right here. Because if I choose a certain publisher, I will try very hard not to name any, I'm obliged to take the whole package. They will organize a peer review, they will publish it, and hopefully they will archive it, and then let's hope that they don't disappear, because if not, they fail. And this package deal is problematic because this combination of multiple functions means that we often choose a publisher for one of the reasons, but we need to take all the three others with them, right? And for instance, like in my case, I think that UGent cares a lot about the certification. The fact that some big journal says that yes, what this Ruben guy is doing over there, it kind of makes sense, right? This is, I think, to them very important. However, it also means that the registration has to happen with them. It also means that they're responsible for making sure that it's published and archived and that they communicate about it being available and so on. So there's a lot of things I'm putting in their hands simply because I need a certification from them, right? And in this case with the URI, I mean, what I do is I self-publish as well. So articles that I write, I will also publish them on my website as HTML, very easily accessible. However, I still need a certification because, as we said before, on my space I say whatever I want. So I want someone to prove that yes, indeed, it makes sense what you write. So even if I self-publish, I'm still obliged to go through the whole process and have someone else publish it. And if I'm lucky, they will still allow me to keep my own copy. So this is how crazy these things get. Now, when we decentralize, we don't depend on a central actor. It also means that we can independently choose different providers for each of the functions, and we can even choose multiple. For instance, suppose that we're writing a paper together with multiple co-authors, and every institution has their own requirements as to what constitutes a valid registration. Well, no problem. We can just register the paper a couple of times. Maybe put it on the blockchain one time. Maybe we put it through a national authority who puts a stamp on there physically. I don't know. The fact is that we can ask multiple of them and independently of how we do the certification. And archiving, we can also then do, for instance, every institution could have their own copy, would have some long-term archives. So we are free to choose how to deal with those things. And the choice is independent. So again, the notion of choice is very important here and comes back. Now, how does this work? Well, remember the personal data part. We have this notion here of a researcher part in which that researchers store their personal artifacts. So basically, if I write an article, I will digitally sign it and I will put it in my researcher part. If I do revisions, same thing. If I review another article, well, the review is mine. I wrote it, so I'll put it in my personal data vault and I sign it. So people can always say, well, yes, he thought that my paper was a good idea. Look, here's the signed proof I have. I could add comments, I could add annotations to papers, and all of those things I just store in my pod because they're mine. And because they're mine, I can also decide who gets to see them. Maybe I'm making annotations that are private, that I just want to share with my colleagues, but not with the rest of the world. I have that option because the data is mine. I can also store data that others create for me. For instance, if I register my paper, while the result of registration is digitally signed, I put it in my data vault. So I can prove, yes, I registered, I was the first to have this claim. So all of these things become possible if we manage our own research data. Now, just for your imagination, this is, for instance, what such a network could look like. And this picture is by Herbert van der Zompel. So it is a network of researchers, artifacts, and also scholarly actors. So we can basically more directly network with each other without depending on a research social network, such like all the ones that I've been discussing previously, or a publisher. Like, we don't depend on them in general. We use them for their functions. We like the fact that they give a service, which is registration, which is peer review. That's all very useful. They serve as an important input to the network. But we don't depend on them to steer those processes because we can be in control. Before I conclude, as you have a question on how does this work with community-owned data and how can you agree with the community what to share under which conditions? So I've told you only the simplified story, where in this case every person has their own data pod, but we could think much more broadly. We could give organizations a pod, we could give communities a pod, and so on. So if there's like every moment there's a notion of shared ownership or shared control, for simplicity, we could give them a shared space. And it's not an exotic case because with the government, we've been discussing the case where, let's say, a car gets their own data pod because, it might be me or a friend driving a certain car. So now the fines have to be attached to the car, not the person. So the same principle, we can give anything a pod. So the simple version is we start with people, but in the long term, anything can get a pod. And then we get from Sally, I wonder how these ideas could be fed into such initiatives as the European Open Science Cloud and so on. So there's interesting connections there, obviously, and interoperability is a main goal of Solid. Like the majority of the work we do focuses on how do we let different systems work together. So I'm a bit fuzzy on the details of the Open Science Cloud, but as far as I understand, it is more of a platform kind of thing on which you put things. So the difference would be that all of the pieces that we publish, we put them in our own pods. That said, we still need archiving and so on. It's a function. So you could imagine that the Open Science Cloud actually takes a role as an archive and duplicates, caches some of that content, so that all makes sense. And the fact that things are duplicated or cached doesn't change the story because the source of truth doesn't change. So this is why I told my story in length, because yes, I'm fine with Mendeley having a copy and with academia and Google Scholar having copies, but I'm the source of truth. So if you see them as caches and facilitators, I think this makes a lot of sense. So now see that EOS gives mini about linking resources and existing sources, which is great because this means that if we all have our own stuff, then we could use this cloud to do interlinking. So today I'll talk to you about the World Wide Web, universality and the threats to it. We've discussed personal data and how to take back control. And then I showed how we could apply that to scholarly communication to see at least if things could work without centralized actors and then how that could be done. I'll leave you with a couple of words of wisdom to conclude. They're not mine. Alan Kay is famous in the computer science for a quote where he said, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And this has been a quote by which some technologists, especially in Silicon Valley, have lived. Like, if you know what the future looks like, well, just build stuff and you will see it. Unfortunately, even though I'm sure that Alan Kay had the best of intentions, this has gotten us a bit where we are today. A lot of technology being invented, and suddenly we are having a future which we might not have wanted. So within a Solid community, we're actually slightly more in favor of this slight alteration to the quote, which is by John Perry Barlow. The best way to invent the future is to predict it. And what he means is that, look, let's imagine the future that we want. Let's think if that's a good idea first, and then build technology we need to predict it. So just like in the story I started with the nightmare and the monsters, where, Max decided, you know what, this is the world I want and I'll just do what I need for it. Well, I think it's up to technologists, up to librarians, up to lawyers, up to sociologists and so on to see what do we need and how can we shape innovation, and let's build the things that we need to make that happen. One more question before I wrap up. Actually, I'm happy to take many more. Will the COVID crisis speed up this decentralization, you think? I'm pretty sure. I think that Corona now is speeding up a lot of things on the digitalization front. However, I have a bit of a concern that we might be going too fast, in the sense that I already see a couple of platforms pop up which demand you to send your data right there. So I hope when things get calmer, we can take a step back and look at what we really need. But yeah, there's definitely some possibilities in that direction. Henry Story has written a blog post on COVID and Solid, I take it. So have a look there. Henry is always the man with the good ideas, so you might want to check what he's written about this. And actually also check my Twitter feed. There's a couple of initiatives happening in Belgium as well. Stanley says, I wonder if it would be interesting to explore the link of this ecosystem with initiatives such as collections as data. I'd be very happy to. Sarvan Kapadisley is one of the people also working on Solid and very active in scholarly communication. He'd also be interesting to check that out. Then we have Anu asking, how will you approach the discovery of these distributed resources? And this again, if you go back to the network, where are you network here? So this only shows the people, but this is a network where there's a lot of room for additional actors, right? So rules such as discovery and search, they can be played by existing systems. So as I mentioned before, my goal is not to say, let's get away with all the publishers and all the parties. What I'm saying is that we should rethink their roles. They can be very useful in a system like this one. It's only the original source of truth that we're changing, but discovery is still a very useful service you could provide to the network. Could I please repeat the name of the person with the blog post? Actually, it's in the chat. If you just scroll a little bit up, Henry is on the chat and he has posted the link right there. Do you expect grandma to manage her data? It is quite complicated. No. Very importantly, with Solid, the main theme is choice. So I want people to be able to measure data if they want to. I realize that most people don't want to for all of the data, which is fine. So let people manage the data they really care about. In the case of grandma, control and choice also means that she delegates her control to one of her grandchildren who know much more about this stuff. And this is again difference with privacy, because privacy means, it's your responsibility. You have to make sure that you don't expose what you don't want to. Whereas control means you have the right to also delegate these powers to someone else. So it's all about choice. It's not about forcing people. It's just about giving them the ability to do so if they want. And Sarvan himself is on chat, so he's shared one of the links. Definitely check that out. I mean, actually, a lot of this thinking, he was one of the first people to inspire me with it, so I owe a lot to him. So if you want to get inspired, definitely follow the link that he's posted on chat. Good. Just having a quick look at the chat if there's any other burning questions. Of course, I don't disappear. Here's my website with plenty more things about Solid. You can also tweet or follow me and see what's happening. I'm very happy to discuss over email at any point. These days, I'm very available. We can just drop in a meeting like this one. Good. Then I see no further questions. The recording will also be made available. I hope you liked it. And yes, take care, everyone. Stay safe, both for you personally and your family as your personal data. Let's talk later. Bye-bye.